Europe's History, Part 2, from the Renaissance to the Cold War. Let's get going. Okay, so the first concept we'll cover in European history or in Europe's history will be the Renaissance. And what the Renaissance is actually a period of rebirth. And it is a period of rebirth going back from the last time when we closed, last thing we closed on were the Middle Ages. So what it was is this. It was a period of rebirth going away from the Middle Ages and back to the beginning of Western civilization, which was Greek and Rome. So what happened is, if you guys think about the Middle Ages, we call it also the Dark Ages. During the Renaissance, the people at that time got away from the influences of the Middle and Dark Ages, and they moved back. They looked back to a better time, a brighter time, and they took their influences in art and government from that time from Rome. So Renaissance is actually means rebirth. It is the revival of art and learning of the people at that time. And it was also a renewed interest in the cultures of ancient Greek and Rome. And this is just an example with the art for the Renaissance. These two pictures, they illustrate the rebirth of the going back to the art, going back to the times of Greek and Rome. This first picture is a typical picture from medieval times. If you take a look at it, there are a couple of qualities from it that make it distinctly medieval. One is that it's very flat. There's very little texture in it. Everything looks pretty much flat, like a kindergartner drew it almost. The second thing is that it had a religious connotation, a religious tone. Most of the art during the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, were very religious in tone. It was not, everything was about the church. Very little was about the individual. Now let's contrast that to the Mona Lisa, which is one of the most famous pieces of art in the world, but it's also pretty indicative of the art of that time at the Renaissance. Take a look at it. Let's contrast these two. And the Mona Lisa is much more like the art of Greece and Rome than it was like for medieval times. So taking a look at it, one, it does not have a theme. There are no religious themes or undertones with it. Also, two, take a look at this picture. Actually has depth. It almost looks like a real person. You can see the warmth and the colors. Taking a look at difference at these two. Also, the different materials that were used. Oil paintings were used. So these two are just an example. And this occurred in everything during this period of time when people were breaking away from the Middle Ages, looking back to Greece and Rome. And also, like, as far as education and invention, those things were big. We saw during this time some of the most important, literally some of the most important inventions on the history of mankind. This one, for example, is the printing press. The printing press allowed people to print books for the first time, because before this time, books had to be handwritten. So what that means is that very few people owned books, and it was generally the wealthy. With the invention of the printing press, you were able to mass produce books. More books were put in the hands of the people, and more people were actually able to read. This was humongous. This was huge. Very few people owned books before this time. And it was invented by this man, Johann Gutenberg. And this is just recapping it. During this time, Gutenberg developed a printing press, which used movable type. The first book that was ever printed was the Bible. The printing press and writing in vernacular, the native language, made works more accessible and affordable. And let me explain this to you guys. Before this time, the Bible and most books were only written in Latin. Latin was the language of education. So not only did you have to know your language, let's say if you were from France, if you wanted to read something, not only did you have to be able to read and comprehend French, you had to be able to read and comprehend Latin. Because that was the language that that the monks and priests wrote in and understood. And if you recall back what I mentioned earlier, the monks and priests were the people who had to handwrite books back then. The invention of the printing press allowed more books to be put in the hands of people, thousands and thousands of more books, exponentially more books. Also, it allowed those books to be written in native languages. So you didn't just have books written in Latin anymore. You had books written in Spanish, in English, and French. Very, very big. Very, very big. That brings us to this guy. As a result of these Bibles, let's focus on the Bibles. Let's not talk about any other books, but let's just focus mainly on the Bibles. One unintended consequence, you want to say, of the Renaissance was that of the printing press is that more people were able to read the Bible. Because until this point in time, there was only one person, generally, one or two people per town who could read the Bible. Probably a very wealthy person who was educated and they could speak Latin, but also the priests. So in order for people to go to church, and people were extremely religious during this time, the only way that people were able to understand, or the Bible had to be translated from them, for them, through the priests. This changed everything, okay? As a result, you had more people reading the Bible, more people forming their own thoughts and opinions of the Bible that was separate and independent of the church. And this guy, Martin Luther, did this thing, which is he nailed his 95 Theses on the church wall in Germany. And what the 95 Theses was, if you guys remember from one of our earlier videos, the video on religion, it was a list of things that the Catholic Church was doing wrong, and the Catholic Church had to get back, had to stop doing in order to become closer with God and not as corrupt. And this just very briefly kind of recaps what I said earlier. In the 1500s, a monk named Martin Luther challenged the Catholic Church. He challenged the practice of giving indulgences, which was giving blessings or saying that you would go to heaven, buying your way into heaven, pretty much. As a result of Martin Luther, we have what is called the Reformation, which is a movement for religious reform of the Catholic Church, which led to the formation of other Christian churches that did not accept the authority of the Pope. This sect of people who broke away from the Catholic Church became known as Protestantism. That is where you see a lot of the major religions that you see today, especially in the southern part of the United States. Baptists, Anglicans, Methodists, all of these came from the Protestant Reformation. This did not exist before Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, which occurred, of course, as a result of more people reading the Bible, more people being able to read the Bible and form their own opinions about what the Bible meant. Also, I mentioned earlier, one of the inventions about how important inventions occurred during the Renaissance. Another invention were compass, and not just a regular compass, but compasses that could be used on ships. These are important because it allows sailors to be able to travel further than they had traveled before. Also, different kinds of ships were built that were able to be gone for longer periods of time. These were important because it allowed for the beginnings of the explorations that occurred that allowed the Americas to be discovered by European pioneers. So during the 15th century, the Europeans began to explore and expand. This led to the discovery of the Americas, and there were three primary motivations behind this exploration and expansion. One was God. Some Europeans believed that it was their duty to spread Christianity to the uncivilized people of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Also was gold, to find new trade routes for spices and raw materials. So to find quicker ways to Asia, the Americas, India, and Africa, in order to trade, to be able to get their goods to port quicker. And glory. Fame and glory for both your country and yourself. Now, after the age of the Renaissance and the age of exploration, we go into what is called the age of the Enlightenment. And what the age of the Enlightenment is it was an intellectual movement that stressed the use of reason and the power of the individuals to solve problems, than the use of the traditions and established doctrines of the church. All of this occurred as a result of the Renaissance, because people, and the invention of the printing press, because people were able to print books more, not just print books, print newspapers and get their thoughts out there. This was big before this, so you started having the first pamphlets and thoughts, and people were able to read and transmit people and exchange ideas to one another. This led to the Enlightenment, where people started breaking away from the church. This already started occurring in the Renaissance. It was heightened during the Enlightenment. This guy, He's an Enlightenment philosopher, someone very important to us in our government here in the United States of America. His name is John Locke. And John Locke believed that the liberty of a man in society is to be under no legislative power, but that established by consent in the Commonwealth. What that just means is he believed in the power of the people, and he believed in representative government. Let me kind of backtrack a little bit. During this time, you guys, people did not have the type of governments that we had right now. They did not have governments by the people. Most of the governments, if not all of the governments this time, people were still ruled by kings and queens. Okay, so the kings and queens were still thought to be descendants of God or descendants of divinity, and they were thought of at this time to still be the only power or the primary power, the central authority figure in most of these countries, right underneath the church. John Locke came out with something different and said, no, people are given powers by God. We're all given our authority by God, and we can only be ruled if we want to rule. No king has power over us. The next guy we'll discuss is the Baron Montesquieu. And Baron Montesquieu is another person who's important to us in the United States with our form of government. Power should be a check to power. Baron Montesquieu developed the concept of checks and balances and separations of powers for the government, which meant that the different branches of government should be able to check one another. It should be able to check and withhold the power of others to prevent one branch from becoming too strong. So all of the power would not be in the hands of a monarch or a king or a queen. These were revolutionary thoughts. These men, their lives were in danger for printing these thoughts because they were actually threatening, or they were actually going against the authority of the government at that time, which was the monarchy. And the last person we'll discuss is this guy, Voltaire. And Voltaire came up with the concept of our First Amendment, which is the freedom of speech. And his famous quote is, "I do not agree with a word you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Freedom of speech. So these, look at these guys, these philosophers, these Enlightenment philosophers, Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire. They were a tremendous influence on the governments, modern day governments, pretty much everywhere in the world. Not just on ours, pretty much everywhere in the world. Representative government, power to the people to choose how they be governed, checks and balances, the separation of powers of the government, and freedom of speech. Tremendous influence. And as you can imagine, people went from these ideals of these Enlightenment philosophers were very, very, very influential, and they they inspired the political revolutions of the 17th and 19th centuries, which occurred through the 16 and 1800s. We're talking about the English Civil War, the American Revolution, and French Revolution, which all dealt with people rebelling against the government at that time, which was the monarchy, which were people saying that they had the right to choose how they would be governed, and in some form or another rebelling against the monarchy of that time. Right after the Enlightenment, we go to the period of the Industrial Revolution. And we've discussed the Industrial Revolution before in one of our previous videos. But what it basically is, just as a recap, is when people started using machinery for the first time, and that led to an increase in being able to increase use of goods, or being able to increase more goods, an increase in the use of machinery to make goods. And the Industrial Revolution resulted in urbanization, which means that the growth of cities. It also dramatically impacted living and working conditions and led to the beginning of the factory system. I want you guys to focus a little bit on these illustrations. Of course, this first one is where it's of a factory. That is pretty self-explanatory. But the second one, which is just as important of the Industrial Revolution, deals with the way that cities were built, or the plight of the people in the cities. If you take a look at this, okay, there you go. Very dirty. People were living in unclean living conditions, both at work. People were working in very dangerous and unclean conditions, and people were living in very unclean and dangerous conditions as a result of the growth of the cities and expansion of the Industrial Revolution. Because of this led to the development of the first labor unions, which were a group of workers who formed to pressure business owners to improve the wages and working conditions. And we mentioned this before, that it was not uncommon at this time, of course, for people to live. I think I mentioned 1 in every 10 workers, steel workers at this time, lost their life. So the working conditions were very, very hard. They were worse than really anything that we, of course, way worse than anything we can think of today in the United States. Even when we think about the working conditions, I think in a lot of third world countries, they're much worse than those working conditions. I'm not sure, but I think you guys probably read The Jungle in middle school. And what that book is about, of course, is the working conditions in a meatpacking factory in Chicago during this time. Very, very disturbing, but it discussed in details body parts falling into the sausage mix, rats, all the kind of things that go into it. And it was just, so it really illustrated the working conditions during that time. Also, though, during the Industrial Revolution, people started having new ways of thinking about the economy. So we had the growth of cities, these horrible working conditions for people, these horrible living conditions led to the development of the first unions. Also, it caused people though to start thinking about the economy in different ways. And then during this time, we came up with the 2 competing economic theories that competed throughout the 20th century, which was capitalism, which was written by Adam Smith in the book The Wealth of Nations, which espoused the theory of capitalism, and communism, which was by socialism. I apologize. The Communist Manifesto, which espoused socialism and communism, which eventually led to communism by Karl Marx and Engels. So these were 2 competing economic theories that dominated the 20th century. And we want to think about it, just kind of tie into what we did before previously. Capitalism deals with capitalistic economy, a market economy. Communism is, of course, a command economy. Moving forward very quickly, we're moving forward and just highlighting very quickly the main points of European history. You guys will spend all of next semester, the entirety of your first semester of your sophomore year, going over this. Europe history, the next thing we're dealing with is World War I, which was from 1914 to 1918. And this was caused by competition between different countries in Europe, the nationalism, which is the belief that your country is better than other people's. As a result of that, Germany lost. Germany was involved in World War I. They lost. The Treaty of Versailles was the treaty that ended World War I. And it was a conference of the victorious Allied powers which determined that Germany was guilty for starting the war. So as a result of these countries basically made life very hard for Germany. They wrecked the German economy. They reduced Germany's military. They reduced Germany's territory, which means they took land from Germany and gave it to other countries. And they also forced Germany to pay reparations, which were payment for damages or were payment for the other countries for forcing Germany to go to war with them. These reparations wrecked the German economy. People were starving. We talked about hyperinflation was caused by this, which meant that the German dollar, was worth pretty much nothing during this time. So the countries, and as a result of this, the German people became hateful towards the rest of the world. They became hateful towards Jewish people who some felt cut a deal with the Allied powers, that they cut a deal during the Treaty of Versailles negotiations that were too hard on the German people. And that led to, of course, some of the things that we saw to the beginnings of World War II, or that laid the foundation for World War II. But before we get into World War II, really quickly, something else that you'll see with World War I, importance of World War I, of course, is trench warfare, which means that people dug trenches to kind of hide in. That people actually lived in miles and miles and miles of trenches. But World War I is the first modern war. It's the first war where people used advanced weaponry. We mean bombs, grenades, airplanes, biological and chemical warfare. World War I was the first war. It was the first war for that. And going back to the reparations and the things that were done to the German economy as a result of the sanctions put on Germany by the rest of the world, they laid the seeds for this guy, Adolf Hitler, to come into power in Germany and to also begin World War II. And World War II occurred, the United States involvement, World War II occurred from 1939 to 1945 in Europe, and the United States became involved in 1941 to 1945. And under World War under World War II, Germany under Hitler and Italy under Mussolini, they began an aggressive policy of expansion, which means that they started taking back the lands that were given, that the Allied powers took away from them in World War I. Not only did they take those lands, they kept going and started taking other lands. The Allied powers, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States, opposed Germany and the Axis powers, which were made of Germany, Italy, and Japan. One big thing that occurred in World War II was the Holocaust, which were the systematic killing of 12 million people by Nazi Germany. They took Jewish people, gypsies, homosexuals, people from Poland, if you were handicapped, and they put them in concentration camps. And of course, the goal was to systematically kill as many of these people in these groups as possible. These are pictures of people who are in a concentration camp. If I recall correctly, one of these men were in the concentration camp, one for being married to a Jewish woman, and two for not giving the Nazi salute. And this is what happened to him, and this is what people look like after being in the concentration camps. Eventually, the Allied powers were victorious. However, World War II left Europe ruined and divided, and it set the stage for the Cold War. And the Cold War was basically a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, and their two competing governments and their two competing economic systems over who would be the dominant world power. You see the United States and the capitalistic countries in this illustration. They are in blue. You also see in Europe the allies of the United States, the Western countries, the democratic market economies are in blue. And in the Soviet Union, we see the Soviet Union and their allies, China and Cuba, the communist countries of the world at that time, and their command economies, their economic systems, and communist governments. So it was a war, both economic and is sometimes an actual war to see who would influence the world. And the division of Europe brought about the Cold War, which once again was just basically a power struggle between the communist and non-communist countries of the world. Eastern Europe at this time was communist, which was made up of part of Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, that these countries were communist. Western Europe, you want to think about Spain, Portugal, France, Great Britain, Italy. They were democratic countries. As a result of World War II, Germany was cut in half, and the city of Berlin was cut in half. So the eastern part in this map is of Berlin, and the eastern part of Berlin was, of course, communist. It was controlled by the Soviet Union, and the western part of Berlin was controlled by the Western Allies, and it was, of course, democratic. So within this one city, what the Soviet Union eventually did was built a wall that cut through, that separated the communist parts of Berlin, the city, from the non-communist part. So it would just be like as if someone built a wall going down Burnside, separating one part of Gonzales from the other. This is a picture of the Berlin Wall while it was still up. And as you can see, there's a lot of graffiti. What you do not see, though, and take a look at it, it's not just a wall. Like, there is a wall. This wall appears to be about 20 yards thick. 20 yards thick. This is actually where soldiers walk. This is barbed wire. So it separates one part of Berlin from the other. The Berlin Wall came to become a symbol for communism in the world in the Cold War. Now, many East Germans fled or left West Germany, fled to West Germany to escape communism, and that has provoked the Soviet Union to build the Berlin Wall to stop the movement of people. The Berlin Wall eventually came down in 1990. And with the coming down of the Berlin Wall, and also due to different reforms and the collapse of the command economy in the Soviet Union, we saw pretty much that marked the end of communism. Please remember to highlight the answers to the homework learning targets in your notes guide, and also to answer all questions in bold lettering. The end. Have a good day. See you in class.